in two different ways, two stories in fact, one visual and one verbal. So I'm giving the images their own platform, and meanwhile I will talk based on a prepared text. But be aware, you already noticed that my text doesn't follow the images, but I assembled them for you to be better able to imagine a multi-script world through the arts. And some of the pictures directly connect to what I will tell you, but others more in a general way. So it's an experiment, and maybe a tip is don't start reading, because I will talk about reading. There are some red threads that might summarize my presentation, and it was announced as reading scripts outside dictionaries. But some possible other titles are When We Travel Between Words and Image, We Do Read When We Cannot Read, Script as a Key to the City, Scripts, Storytelling and Story Listening. And the question before I really start, when only a few languages and often only one script dominates, what stories are we telling and what social inequities are we ignoring? I've been interested in language for many years now, including philosophy of language, the impact of language in social-political contexts, the impact of translation, how you can play with language and also their scripts. And from an artistic point of view, it intrigues me how a text can be word and image at the same time. I'd like to explore different positions between legible and illegible, up to and including what's called asemic writing. Asemic texts are nonsensical, it's kind of scribbling, but an intended one that refers to text, speaks of text, mirrors the visuality of text or book pages, magazines, and so on. It's a kind of reflection on words and texts being visual entities with a very specific identity. An identity that speaks and conveys meaning, that expresses a message even if you're not able to read it as a comprehensible text. It conveys meaning that is extra linguistic. We do read when we cannot read. We do interpret. We are interpreting beings. And this extra dimension that text, whether legible or not, is still readable, but outside the dictionary, outside certain codes or agreements. That is also what concerns me whilst thinking of Antwerp as a multilingual city. Although from the view and practice of the government, we are a Dutch-speaking part of Latin Belgium, aside the French and German-speaking parts. And as I'm very much concerned with diversity and inclusion, with broadening our canon, making room for other perspectives, in our city and in our art schools, my trajectory with languages and scripts became a red thread throughout different activities and roles, and where I'm able, I will advocate for plurilingual and multi-script approaches in and outside arts and design, acknowledging the social and political power relations and processes of inclusion and exclusion that come with languages and script. Quite a learning process and also very revealing. I'm switching the tone. Masa al-khair, goedenavond. I pronounce goedenavond as goedenavond, the way Faris, an Arabic-speaking newcomer, pronounces it. He is new to the Dutch language and is also beginning to use the Latin alphabet for me. And just as he struggles with Dutch sounds, I struggle with Arabic sounds. And we copy sounds from each other. Sometimes our language attempts lead to confusions of tones, sometimes to playful language innovation, ignoring all the rules. Code switching is something we do all the time and on different levels. Language is a living entity. We do not speak dictionary language, but relational and contextual language. We use it to express our deepest emotions, our values, our big and small ideas. And none of this is neutral. Language is not neutral, and neither is translation. Fares and I, we both use Google Translate, and he uses also Gboard, a virtual keyboard to translate his messages automatically from Arabic to Dutch in Latin scripts. And talking about Google and the internet, and as a lifelong student Arabic, I also try to look for information directly in Arabic, yani in the Arabic scripts. And each time a new world of information, knowledge, experiences and images opens up. Even though the web seems infinite, it is only as big as your language. And I would add immediately, it is only as big as your writing system. If your language with its script is represented at all, or if your language has a written form at all. There are a lot of underserved languages and a lot of unsupported scripts. The website Ethnologue states that there are 7,151 living languages. There are also dead languages, endangered languages, languages that currently are dying out. There are also languages for which a new script is being invented, as in the case of two US-based brothers born and raised in the Republic of Guinea, and they created an indigenous script for Fulani some 30 years ago. They had the Arabic script and others, but this posed a lot of challenges as several Fulani sounds were missing, and there was no standard way of using Arabic letters to represent them. So they developed the Atlan script, an acronym meaning the alphabet that will prevent a people from disappearing. Through my volunteer work as a language buddy for newcomers, I came across many different experiences and perceptions of languages and scripts. And at the same time, I learned a lot from learning a non-Western language and script myself. And I say non-Western language to make the reversal immediately. Fares could say with regard to Dutch, learning a non-Eastern language and script. With a big difference, however, that I can learn Arabic from a position of luxury, without having to depend on it. For Fares, a new language is an important key that gives access to his new home city. For the time being, he is still excluded from a lot. And although we live in Antwerp, in a multilingual city with about 400 languages from all over the world, and many newcomers, as well as people born there, master many languages and often different writing systems, it's often the case that in the social-political space, only one particular multilingualism is valued, and sometimes only one script. Think of white languages versus colored languages, of high status and low status languages, of colonial languages, of linguistic imperialism, linguistic hegemony. From the point of view of languages and their scripts, linguistic diversity, or lack thereof, tells us who uses the city, for whom it is designed and for whom not, who can easily feel at home and who not, who has to assimilate by forgetting their language and script and who not. And Bahia and I have been exchanging about this for a while now, how languages and scripts act in a world full of power dynamics. And the first glimpse of our conversations is printed in Sigrica's School of Arts research journal called TIP. And because TIP is Antwerp-based, we chose to use this local perspective as a starting point, also connected to my photography search for Arabic inscriptions in the public space of Antwerp. And in a paper type work, we started from this visual material as a means to share some small narrative elements that tell about the different experiences of ourselves and of newcomers regarding their mother tongue, their mother script, the learning of a new language and/or script. It's only a very small selection of the many possible positions that we encountered. And our collaboration, reading scripts outside dictionaries, it's really not taught from a typographic design perspective, but rather it engages with a subjective experience from the city. And as we think of Antwerp, it concerns a city that is mostly monoscriptural, sometimes biscriptural, essence, and often asymmetrical coexistence of certain scripts tells us. Script as a key to the city. What does a script evoke before we understand the meaning of the words written? I grew up in the visual arts and I was not trained in typography, and Bahia has been studying the manifestations of the Arabic script for years. And Type Lab is such an amazing and important endeavor, also for diaspora artists in Antwerp. Typographic design in recent years and decades became very emergent for different scripts other than Latin. This is also linked to digitization, where Latin was and still is often the bias, and English the programming language. The first mobile phones, as you know, were not supporting Arabic or other scripts. To Latin letters and numbers that could represent certain Arabic letters, people could text Arabic. And this Arabici is also used in other contexts. I'll come back to that. But first, something else I want to share. Aside that I find it difficult to convey subtleties in a language I don't master enough, there's also an uncomfortable feeling when I speak English, and I have to use it a lot. But I don't manage to agree with it. My bodily experience of English doesn't coincide with my being. There's always this kind of alienation. And then I think of those who are new to Dutch and cannot share their knowledge, or if they can share it after a while, they cannot share it in the right way. There's certainly in Flanders a lot of intolerance when it comes to language. So they encounter incomprehension, they remain excluded and are often and necessarily very dependent on the goodwill of others. It's a very tiring position, which also leads to feelings of shame and frustration. One example of an uncomfortable dependence in the private sphere is when I accompanied an Arabic-speaking newcomer to the hospital. He was new to Dutch and not that familiar with Latin script. And I helped him explain to the doctor what was wrong, and he had to do an eye test. And I explicitly asked the doctor to not use the test with the Latin alphabet, but the one with the characters where you only have to point out the direction of the opening, left, right, up, down. And we have, for example, a Kurdish friend of whom I was once a language buddy too, told me after living in Antwerp for a few years now, she wants to move to Brussels, our capital, where also French is spoken. She really doesn't like the Dutch language, but feels a connection with French, although it would mean to start all over again with new language courses. Rihab grew up in northern Syria, and Kurdish is her home language, but she's also obliged to use Arabic in the context of school and government. And Arabic for her is on the one hand deeply connected to her religion, but on the other hand it is the imposed language in a very specific political context. And the first thing she wants to do when she receives a Belgian passport is change her name into a Kurdish one, which means also another script. I have many narrative elements from newcomers that I could share, but I'm still struggling how to engage with them from an ethical research point of view. And online I also encountered a lot of different and opposing reactions from Arabic-speaking people or native-speaking Arabic towards foreigners learning modern standard Arabic as I do, or Fusca, and not a dialect. But that's another story with many layers and perspectives. My experience in Antwerp, however, is a very positive one. I have the chance to meet a lot of Arabic-speaking people with different origins, from whether Moroccan, Syrian, Iraqi, Palestinian, Yemen, Egyptian, and so on. And in one way or another, we managed to exchange rather easily in an appreciative way. Even in our evening school, our native teachers are pleading for modern standard Arabic instead of some non-native teachers who are thinking of teaching only Moroccan Arabic. It's an ongoing discussion. But we know, certainly currently and throughout history, language has always been a theater of conflict and all too often a way of denying rights, excluding minority groups, or making them assimilate. Imposing or banning a language or a script has many far-reaching consequences, like ignoring knowledge, experience, values, feelings, and so on. Some languages had their scripts changed due to political decisions, making it impossible for one generation to consult the books of the previous one, although it concerns the same language. Regardless which language or which script, there are also the words of Patricia Hill Collins to remember. Oppressed groups are frequently placed in a situation of being listened to only if we frame our ideas in the language that is familiar to and comfortable for a dominant group. This requirement often changes the meaning of our ideas and works to elevate the ideas of the dominant groups. We return to scripts. This means even before we read the linguistic context and understand it correctly or not, even before we judge whether or not they appear typographically in the right form, even before we know which script is involved. My focus here is on examples of the Arabic script with additional letters, diacritics, vowel marks also for several other languages used in Asia and Africa, as you know. For students, Arabic is a very slow learning process. Coming across Arabic and not being able to make sense of it, and then realizing that it's not Arabic, but another language in the Arabic script. But I can already see that it might be Farsi or Urdu. And thanks to Daniel Shah, one of our new PhD researchers in the arts, a Pakistani photographer, I recently saw a picture of our Belgian king fully surrounded by the Perso-Arabic script. Apparently our royal family was Pakistani news during their bike ride on Car-Free Sunday. As students, we struggle a lot, for example, also with words that don't seem to follow an Arabic logic, to finally discover that it concerns transliterations into Arabic proper names, such as Trump or Macron. And reminds me of a specific billboard that states in Latin script, Donald Trump, and then the sentence continues in Arabic script. لا يستطيع قراءة هذا ولكنه لا يزال خائفا منه. He can't read it, but he's scared of it anyway. And as we speak politics, I remember a tweet from an Antwerp politician that says, new bakery in medicine, using Arabic. Arabic inscriptions were no problem, I was told during the election campaign. The truth is, we are being colonized. Stop Islamization, ban Islam. Luckily, also reactions as only Arabic appears to be a thorn in the side, referring to the many other languages and scripts present in our city, or at least in some parts of our city. Another image that I'm thinking of comes from a lecture from Anna Acker, in which she talks about a student who doesn't feel at home in the English-speaking and therefore Latin environment he ended up in. And his solution to cope with this feeling of alienation was drawing himself, lying in his room, in the house, in the street, adding different words in the Arabic script to his drawing. Latin and Arabic, a lot of different contexts where they intermingle. like the Arabic, also used for the Urdu language, for example, or in the context of slang and colloquialism as an informal chat alphabet, and used by diaspora peoples who had to convert to another script or grew up in another script than their mother tongue. I could also refer to the example of the commentary in Beiruti greeting, Hi, Kekek Sava, an amalgamation of English, Arabic, and French, which tells a lot about a specific history and how Arabic is looked at versus other languages and scripts. The relationships between Latin and Arabic that I just mentioned are of a completely different order than in my very first lessons Arabic, which were in the Latin script, using an academic transliteration system. I always found it very problematic learning Arabic through Latin script, but I can also think of another example which is in fact very useful. I use a specific app to listen to the Quran recited in Arabic, with written Arabic, with translation and with transliteration, in quite different contexts to use Latin. While the Quran is fully vocalized, this is not the case with ordinary texts, where it can be quite difficult for a student Arabic to read a new text, pronounce words correctly, know which specific meaning is involved. The more because Arabic is an abject focusing on consonants. Aside non-vocalized text, some while ago I also stumbled upon an Arabic text without any dots that distinguished consonants from each other. It was a message by activists on social media. Sorry, starting there so you can see them twice. Website. The social media, the message was without the dots, for activists that wanted to circumvent censorship and that therefore turned to ancient Arabic to post messages about the conflict between Palestine and Israel. Another example I thought of in the sphere of Latin and Arabic takes place entirely on the level of the graphic. It concerns the Butemene project, where Arabic letters are formed via lowercase Latin and Greek letters, rotated or inverted. And this is by no means a transcription of Arabic, Latin and Greek letters, but it has been used purely graphically to mimic Arabic letters. And it was one of the proposals put forward after a call of contribution by the Cairo Academy for the Arabic Language for the simplification of Arabic. We return to Faris. When I see him writing his first words of Dutch, I see how he builds up each letter from right to left. I see how he uses upper and lower cases interchangeably, letters interchangeably within one word, and when he has to find the answer to some questions in a short Dutch text, he scans the text from right to left. And if you think in terms of Arabic, it makes perfect sense. If you think in terms of Dutch, it's another story, of course. And I'm curious, I can't go back to that moment where I experimented with my first writing of Arabic letters. Meanwhile, I developed my own handwriting instead of copying the school book. But of course, native writers can see that I'm not a native writer, as I still use dots and no line or circumflex accent to, for example, distinguish between a scene and a sheen and so on. But writing Arabic slowly became something bodily, something that my hand remembers. And also when I'm drawing, for example, I see myself starting from right to left instead of left to right. And also when I add a semic text part in my drawings, it's based on Arabic and not on Latin, which I'm enjoying very much. And while texting and not handwriting with Faris, it's like a real language course outside the classroom. I see, for example, how he extends words in Arabic to emphasize something, of how certain vowels are communicated without the specific vowel notes or by using diacritical marks and so on, other than usually. And it teaches me examples of how you can play with the script in specific contexts. And this is all before any type sign comes into the picture, and let alone handwriting or calligraphy. Latin has been a bias for me as I grew up with it, but also worldwide. It has been the default script for too long, to the point where you can even talk about type colonialism and designers designing scripts without understanding the language, without even knowing the script, let alone the cultural layers and contextual usages, the aesthetics, the do's and don'ts. Many other scripts are also much more complex than Latin and have specific technical or design challenges. And a very common problem in Antwerp, printing Arabic when unknown to the script, and I recently saw it happening more than once, is that the letters separate from each other, losing their specific beginning, middle, final, and isolated form, therefore disappearing the words and the meaning. And in addition, the letters change places, as if they are mirrored, and the text aligns left. And the chosen font is automatically switched back to a dull standard form. The problem is often even not noticed. We seem to be very sensitive when it comes to Latin, but when it comes to other scripts, we don't know. It's a very different story. These are only some of the problems that arise in the context of Arabic in a Latin script environment, and I only talked here about one script, while there are hundreds of writing systems in the world. But my message, of course, and I'm directing my words back to Antwerp, I don't know which direction, for scripts other than Latin. They are not non-Western, they are not exotic, they are not threatening, and they are not just an image to be manipulated and cut up by a Latin gaze. Then my question to my schools of arts is, given the multilingual city and multilingual schools, our students, who can guide them when they want to work with scripts other than Latin, when they want to engage in multi-scriptural design? And the expertise is there. It is present in our schools through fellow students, occasionally a colleague like Lorraine Furter or Jules Tormac, but the knowledge is definitely present in our city. Super diversity means multilingualism, means multiple writing systems, means multiple logics and values. A lot of knowledge is out there, and we should not continue ignoring or suppressing this knowledge. Languages, and therefore also scripts, intersect with other marginalized identities. So when only a few languages, and often only one script dominates, what stories are we telling and what social inequities are we ignoring? In order to counter this situation, I collaborate with an organization called The Connection in Antwerp, and they specifically work with artistic newcomers for whom Dutch is a new language, and sometimes also a new script. Up till now, we organized 4 intense project weeks and other activities in which we're welcoming multilingualism in different ways. Not only do we create an environment where it feels safe to enter the community with your mother tongue and mother script, finding interpreters or finding ways to translate on the spot, we also work together in a participative and co-creative way open to the specific artistic skills of the participants and newcomers. Those who want to practice Dutch also find here an environment where you can make mistakes without people judging you. Also for our students who are joining, these projects are a very interesting learning environment. But our students' population is more diverse regarding languages than our team of lecturers, I must say. In these collaborative projects within a multilingual group, we also approach language and scripts from an artistically and designerly perspective. And it doesn't end there. The work we create together is also a design or an artwork that is added to the public space of Antwerp. And in this context, we had beautiful collaboration with artists and role models like Bahia Shahab, Tema Wan, Younes van den Broek, all three working with language and script in a very different way, but all three very engaged and exploring the borders of legibility. And I'm ending my talk by referring to Forum Plus. It's a journal for research and art in low countries. And together with artist, performer, and researcher Ahilan Ratnamohan, I was invited as a guest editor to open a new dossier on art connected to language, writing, and multilingualism. And we exchanged a lot about languages as a place where power manifests itself and language can unite or divide people. And in this dossier, artists and educationalists, native speakers, readers, and second, third, or fourth language users, they gather their experience. Aylan himself also wrote a beautiful text wherein he deconstructs his experience learning the Tamil script, the script of his mother, was he himself was brought up in English and therefore in a Latin script to better fit in. In his contribution, and I quote, he's examining this personal experience and the typographical construction of the letters parallel to each other. He uses a sort of autofiction to investigate the steps involved in learning a new script, and he really asks the reader to dive into this experience with him by gradually introducing Tamil characters into the text and consequently imprinting them in the heads of the reader. So by slowly changing little words we know, like me or they, into Tamil in a way that you can still read the text, although there's an unknown character interwoven, by carefully adding more and more Tamil characters, you really get excited and a beautiful image appears of a text that starts in one script and tumbles and ends into another script. Voila. Now I'm really looking forward to hear your stories of language and script in a city as Cairo.
Anyone has questions or reflections on the script and the city?
You stated that language is being changed for political reasons, and I thought about that a lot of Palestinian cities have been the name of it has been changed to more sounding Hebrew-like names, and I was thinking of how how can we prevent such a thing?
How can we
prevent such a thing?
Prevent.
Yeah.
Prevent, and we have to go back in history because this morning I saw an atlas here in the library in Arabic, but it used the Roman names for Egypt, for the cities of Egypt, but in the Arabic script, so we have to go back. It's the topographic names and how they are translated into other scripts and other languages. It means that also a lot of values and a broad perspective is added in it, and a whole discourse is added in it. Yeah, it's really problematic, but how we can prevent it, I don't know, by making, trying to create awareness that scripts are not neutral and that language is not neutral, and that it's really connected to, but it's connected to so many things by knowledge, but certainly also by values that can really differ. And it's connected to humanity and how we exclude people and their knowledge, their insights, their feelings, their
Identity. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions?